I didn't really have any expectations for this device in particular. I find a 1x1 screen kinda odd. But then again, I've never really tried a 1x1 screen, so I think we should just open this and take a closer look at it. Just a disclaimer as well, this was sent over to me from Mech DIY. As with all my product reviews, the company is not seeing the video before it goes up. They're not paying me for this review, and of course, all opinions are my own. I'm just going to give you guys my honest thoughts to what I think about it. As I mentioned, this was sent over to me from Mech DIY. They always have nice sales on their website. The RG Cube is also included in part of their sale. You can get this in beige, black, gray, or purple. I opted to get this in the black one, but I think the beige and the gray look pretty nice too. They also have a couple different bundles down here, so if you're interested in getting a bag with it, you can do that too. This thing just looks really interesting overall. We have a 4-inch IPS screen. This is a fully laminated panel with a resolution of 720 by 720. It has the Unisoc T820. This should be pretty good for mid-range emulation, but where I think this one is going to excel is that 1:1 aspect ratio for retro gaming. There's 8 GB of LPDDR4X and 128 gigs of UFS 2.2 storage. UFS storage is a nice bonus because this is going to make the device start up and shut down much quicker. It can also install stuff a lot quicker than traditional eMMC storage. This also has some pretty good Wi-Fi too. We have 5 GHz bands and we have AC Wi-Fi, as well as Bluetooth 5.0. There's also a pretty big battery at 5200 mAh, and this is running Android 13. So let's open it up and take a closer look at the device itself. The box is pretty similar to most Anbernic products. It's just a clean white box, and there's not much to show on it, but it does show that I have the black model here. Let's open the box and see what comes inside. Inside, I have a 256 GB micro SD card. This is going to be all the ROMs and everything that they send with it. I highly recommend using your own because this is just a generic micro SD card. Underneath that, we have the handheld itself. I can already tell this is going to be pretty good for ergonomics. There's the device itself, and I gotta admit, this actually looks a lot better than I thought it would. These little grips on the back are pretty comfy too. The only other thing we get in the box is that traditional Anbernic screen protector and some screen wipes. We also have a USB cable in here. This is probably going to be USB-A to USB-C. Let's take a peek. Yeah, so this is USB-A to USB-C. You just want to use a standard charger for charging this, but we can take a closer look at the charging methods later. So of course we have the device itself, and I think it looks pretty cool. First impressions are pretty good. This feels pretty high quality. The plastic is a nice smooth plastic. The triggers also feel pretty good, and there's a nice amount of resistance to them. Some clicky bumpers, rubber membrane face buttons. I really like this D-pad though. This kind of reminds me of the old Sega Genesis D-pad. The start and select aren't too clicky, but they are dome based. Is definitely a nice improvement over the loud switches on some other devices. The back actually looks pretty nice too. On the back, there's a nice little fan intake. There's a little bit of texture on the inside of the grip. The back is a nice smooth plastic. On the top of the device, we get our 2 bumpers and the triggers. We also have our USB-C, the micro SD card slot, and a 3.5mm headphone jack. We also have the vent that blows out the hot air. There's nothing on the sides, but they are nice and smooth, and they're pretty rounded. This should help you get some pretty decent ergonomics on this. On the bottom, there's 2 downward facing speakers, and where these sit, this shouldn't be an issue. I don't think these are going to get covered by your hands. We have the volume switch on the right side and the power button. This is such an odd place for the power button. I kind of wish this was on the top though. This is an odd design choice for sure, but I don't think it's going to be problematic at all. It's recessed into the device, so you're very unlikely to bump this. Actually, I find this pretty much impossible to press unless I'm deliberately pressing it. How does this stack up compared to the other devices that I have? The smallest device that I have is the MIUI 30, and this thing is absolutely tiny compared to this device. If you put it directly over top, yeah, you can see how much smaller this thing is. This thing is also a lot thicker than the MIUI 30. Stepping things up from there, the 35XX Plus is a little bit bigger. Even with this thing set horizontally, there is definitely quite a difference in size. If I line up the screens, there's about an inch on top with the RG Cube. The TrimUI Smart Pro is definitely a little longer. Different games are going to play better on this device than the TrimUI Smart Pro. Because the TrimUI Smart Pro has a very wide aspect ratio, you're going to get some black bars, and this is going to fill up a good portion on the sides. By default, the TrimUI Smart Pro has some nice bezels though, so this is not really an issue, but some people just prefer the game to fill up the entire screen. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is also very wide compared to the RG Cube. This is going to be very similar to the TrimUI Smart Pro. And if we compare this to the Odin 2, yeah, the Odin is just huge compared to this device. As far as the screen itself, this is about 80mm wide, and being a 1x1 display, this is about 80mm tall. Shockingly, this device is actually pretty thin compared to a lot of the competition, coming in at 18.1mm. If you measure up by where the triggers are on the back of those grips, it comes out to 29mm. Even at the bottom, this is only 29.9mm. To put this into perspective, this is only slightly smaller than the Odin 2 up by those grips as well. Compared to something like the TrimUI Smart Pro, the RG Cube is just much thicker. This is only slightly thicker than the Anbernic SP. So how heavy is this device and how does it stack up to the competition? At the lightest end of the scale, the Mio A30 comes out to 112.8 grams. The Mio Mini Plus comes out to 162.9. The 35XX Plus comes out to 188.7. The TrimUI Smart Pro comes out to 254.5 grams. This is the closest in weight to the RG Cube. The RG Cube comes out to 257.9 grams. I think this is a pretty good weight for the overall device. Stepping things up from there, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is 275.8 grams. The Odin 2 Mini is even heavier at 324.8 grams. And the Odin 2 is by far the heaviest ARM device that I own at 426.2 grams. The TrimUI Smart Pro is definitely the closest in weight. So let's talk a little bit more about the build quality. It's pretty good, and it's about what you expect from Anbernic. The shell is a pretty solid plastic, and I don't have any issues with the plastic itself. I think this is a pretty good quality. The D-pad and the joysticks also feel pretty decent. These are just standard Switch style joysticks, but these are Hall based. They also have a little LED ring around them, which is pretty nice. All the buttons feel fine, and the face buttons feel of high quality. I had a peek around the unit, but I couldn't find any quality control issues. Let's talk about these joysticks. They're pretty decent, but they are Switch style joysticks, so if you've used a Switch before, you already know what these are like. They're not loose by any means, and these are pretty decent. The L3 and R3 feels exactly the same as on a Switch. There's the nice rubbery cap on top, and there's a little bit of texture on the sides. I actually prefer this texture over the standard Switch style. They don't rub on the edges, and the cap kind of just rolls off this anti-friction ring. Being rubber though, these are going to attract a lot of dust. You can also use the Skull & Co Switch caps for these if you want a little extra height on them. You can also see that plastic on here, and you can see that there is a slight texture to it. I think this is pretty nice. As far as the triggers go, they have a good amount of range to them. But I do like these triggers, and they are very comfortable. There's also a small amount of flare on the end, and I think this looks good too. They have a nice amount of pressure to them. Not a ton, but they're not soft by any means. All in all, these are pretty good triggers. The ergonomics on this are pretty good. They have these nice grips on the back, and your fingers can kind of wrap around them the same way that they would on the Odin 2. I kind of curl my fingers up on the sides like this so they wrap around the edges, but you can also just spread them across the back a little too. Either way, I think there's many nice ways to hold this device, and all around it is very comfortable to use. This is kind of what it looks like while I'm holding on the back. It's pretty good. Actually, the ergonomics are something that surprised me. I didn't think they would be this nice. So let's turn on the device and see what the setup process is like. It vibrates once when you turn it on, and that was pretty loud. This is just going to have your standard Android setup, so this might take a little while to complete. I do like these LED rings too. They're really nice. They're extremely vibrant, but they're not super bright. This is just going to be your standard Android screen. They really wanted to show off this nice panel, but I do agree, it does actually look really vibrant. In fact, I'd probably go as far as to say this is the best screen that I've seen from Anbernic. I don't really like their panels because I find their yellows are washed out. But I can already tell just from looking at this chrome icon that the yellow on this screen is incredible. Look how vibrant that is. That's really nice. Whatever screen they put in this, they did an excellent job choosing it. They put some thought into this one. You might see some banding, but that's just my camera recording. This is not visible in person. Before I load anything onto this, I thought it'd be kind of neat to show you everything that's pre-installed on it. So we have a bunch of emulators pre-installed. I personally don't like this because I would have just rather installed my own. And there's a bunch up here too. Let's also do a quick gamepad test just to make sure that everything's working on the device. So the triggers work, bumpers work fine, D-pad works good, and the face buttons work too. Let's try starting to select. It actually looks like there was a front end installed. After pressing this button down here, this switches between the Android interface and their front end. I don't actually think this front end looks too bad. It kind of reminds me of the Nintendo Switch interface. I find Beacon really good for emulation devices like this, but in particular, I find Beacon looks really good for retro systems. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to use their interface. I've already got Beacon installed, so I'm just going to do a quick setup on this. You can activate the game mode right on their pull down menu. Just click it and it'll go between normal and game mode. There's also a key mapper here, but I don't really plan on using that. You can also do things like control the fan. By default, it's going to be set to auto, but since I plan on playing more retro systems on this, I'm going to set this to stop. For the CPU mode, you can either go to the high mode or the auto mode. I'm assuming this high mode is just for the performance mode on the CPU itself. I'm just going to set this to off. The ambient light can be controlled up here too, so you can change it from a couple different things. You can shut those off too if you prefer a more minimalistic look. You can just set this to light. There's a breathing mode, a nice rainbow mode, marquee, a mode called chasing, which seems to follow the direction of the joystick, and a gaming mode. I'm assuming this just changes depending on the game maybe. I'm just going to leave this to the light mode. You can adjust these RGB lights too, and it's pretty easy to do it. All you have to do is just hold down on the ambient light sensor and it'll bring open a menu to change everything that you want about it. You can change the brightness of those. You do have to press apply to see the changes. This isn't going to change in real time. So just swap that over and hit apply. There's a solid light and you can change the color to whatever you want. You can do kind of like a breathing mode and you can change a whole bunch of settings on that too. There's a rainbow mode, which is pretty neat. This is just going to cycle through all the RGB colors. Chasing is pretty cool. As we saw earlier, this just moves around and the light only goes in the direction that you're moving it. I'm just going to go with a solid red for mine and I'm just going to set it to probably like 25%. I think that looks pretty nice, especially on the black. I've also gone ahead and changed mine to the Xbox mode. This was set to the Nintendo Switch mode first, but I've just swapped this over to using the Xbox mode. You can also change the trigger type if you prefer. So I'm just going to set this to Xbox and I'm going to leave it at that. It's been about a week since I've started using the RG Cube and I've had one issue with it. Unfortunately, this one that was sent over had some backlight issues. This isn't really noticeable when I have bright studio lights on, but as that gets darker, you should be able to see it a little bit. I have some up in the corner and a little bit down in the bottom. In fact, if you want, we can shut off the lights here and take a closer look. With the lights off, it's a little bit easier to see, but it is much more noticeable in person. It's around the corners and up in the top here. This is going to largely depend on the angle that you're looking at it from. Most of it seems to be in this bottom left corner. It's not enough that it's going to break my experience with this device, but it is noticeable. Fortunately, this seems to be fixed in newer revisions, and when I talked to Mech DIY, they actually said some pretty positive things about this. Because of the one that I have here, they're going to retest all their models to make sure that this doesn't ship out on retail units. They also asked if I wanted a new screen so I could swap that over to fix this. But the fact that they're rechecking all these units for further customers is really nice. I'm actually quite happy to see that. That is excellent customer service. This gives me some reassurance that when people get this, especially if you buy it from them, that they won't have that issue on these units that they ship out. I used an app called Display Tester to check that. And this is something that's kind of interesting too. They actually have some shortcuts on these bottom buttons here. If you press this one once, it'll go back. But this is also a combo button, so this is also the home button. Press that once to go back, or hold it down and it'll take you back to the home menu. I think that's a pretty cool feature. Now that I've got everything set up on this device, I think it looks pretty cool. I've opted to use Beacon on this since I'm going to be playing more retro style games on this device. Most box art is going to look pretty good on here. You are going to get some systems that just look a little squished. I think Sega Genesis looks extremely nice on this screen. Super Nintendo though gets kind of cut off, so I might have to play around with some of these settings to make it look a little better on this panel. However, this is going to largely depend on the front end that you're going to use. Now that I got this set up, let's do a quick boot test. So I'm going to shut this down and let's do a cold boot just to see how quick this starts up. So now that's off. As soon as I turn this on, let's start the timer and I'll put that on the screen so we can see how quick this starts up. That wasn't too bad at all. I think the reason this starts up a lot quicker is because of that UFS storage, and I'm glad to see Retroid and Anbernic using this now. Everything just becomes way more responsive when you're using UFS storage. I think we need to talk about this D-pad. Out of all the D-pads that I've used, this is easily one of the best. It's extremely easy to push, and it's not loud and clicky like some of the other ones we've been looking at recently. The one on the Anbernic SP actually caused my thumb to kind of tense up, and it really hurt. This only happened on games like Musha though, because you're pressing this extremely quick. But I haven't had that issue on this device. The D-pad is extremely comfortable. It does bottom out when you push it down, so you are likely to get some false diagonals. Personally though, this is the kind of D-pad that I like. I like a mushy D-pad, especially on retro games, just because it feels authentic. It's not likely to tire out your thumb like it is on the Anbernic SP. So if your thumb gets sore from playing on these devices, I think you'll really like this one. Out of all the devices that I've tested and tried, I would say this is probably in the number 2 spot. The best D-pad that I've seen on a device is probably the Odin 2 Mini. This is really nice too. This is exactly how I remember the Sega Genesis style D-pad, and I think you'll really like it. If you want this for true retro gaming, you're going to have a blast with this D-pad. Now that we've talked a little bit more about the device, let's do a quick test on the internal memory and the RAM to see how fast this is. Let's first start off with the RAM. This should actually be a very quick test. Memory doesn't take long to check. So while not being as fast as the memory on the Odin 2 Mini or the Odin 2, this is still very impressive at 32,000 megabytes per second. Now let's check that UFS storage. The test on the internal memory just finished, and this is actually kind of surprising. The read speeds are pretty impressive at 708 megabytes per second. The write speeds are about 212 megabytes a second, which is also pretty impressive. Next up, we need to talk about these speakers, because wow, they surprised me. You expect these down-firing speakers just to sound so-so, but wow, these speakers really blew me away. I didn't expect them to sound this good. I loaded up Cave Noir, as this is the game I like to test the speakers on. And let me show you what this sounds like. I also want this audio test to sound as clean as possible, so instead of using my SM7B, I'm going to try to capture this audio with my new wireless microphone, because that supports lossless audio effectively. So let's take a closer look and see what this sounds like. First up, let's do half volume. I'm also going to use 32-bit float recording so the audio doesn't clip off. This is going to give us the cleanest and best audio possible. So all I gotta say is, wow, these speakers are incredible. They are extremely loud, and it only actually started to clip from these speakers anyways when it hit about 95%. You are going to be blown away by the speakers on the RG Cube. I would say that these are better than the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro speakers, and they're almost as good as the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Mini. The speakers on this aren't going to be quite as clean, but they're still going to be very bassy. I think this is a good balance, and you're not going to be disappointed here. So let's talk a little bit more about the panel. I think the screen on the RG Cube easily beats the Mio Mini. The Mio Mini is just much darker, and the colors aren't as vibrant. One thing I'm definitely noticing for sure is Anbernic has made sure that they put a good screen in this unit. The yellows look a lot better than your traditional Anbernic unit. This compared to the Mio Mini Plus, yeah, the Mio Mini Plus just can't keep up. Moving things up from there to a device that I just recently reviewed, the Anbernic SP looks pretty decent, but the colors definitely aren't as vibrant. The screen is also much darker, and all the units in this review have their panel set to max brightness. I like a bright, vibrant screen, so the one on the SP just doesn't look as good to me. I find the screen on the Mio A30 actually pretty decent. It is a little dark, but the colors look very vibrant and very saturated. I think this is slightly better than the Mio Mini Plus and the Anbernic SP. This panel also has a matte display, so you're not going to get a lot of glare when you're using this. This is really nice for when you're playing it outside. I'm still working on my review for the Mio A30. I've just been so busy, so just make sure to say subscribe so you don't miss this one. Between these two though, the Mio A30 just can't keep up. Stepping things up ever so slightly to an even better panel, the TrimUI Smart Pro is pretty decent. However, one thing that you are going to notice is that this TrimUI Smart Pro panel is definitely not as bright as the RG Cube. This means that a lot of the details that you're seeing here on the road and other parts are a little bit more detailed. This is being slightly washed out because this panel can't get bright enough. A lot of these colors, like these yellows and oranges, especially the blues, look really good on the TrimUI Smart Pro. I absolutely love this panel, and I think they did a really good job choosing it. However, between these two, the RG Cube just looks so much nicer. It's a lot sharper, the colors are more vibrant, and there's a lot more brightness. So the TrimUI Smart Pro isn't as good. When we step things up to the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, this is where things start getting pretty interesting. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is known for having a really good panel. This screen is extremely vibrant, and I've also boosted it, just ever so slightly to about 1.2. However, you're still noticing that the Anbernic screen is a lot sharper. I've liked the screen for a long time, but I'm leaning more towards the RG Cube as the better panel. This is almost too vibrant and some of the details are just being washed out, whereas this still looks vibrant, but it also looks extremely sharp. Both of these are plenty bright too, so when it comes down to it, the RG Cube in my opinion has a better panel. Stepping things up ever so slightly, while the Odin 2 is just so much better. The colors are extremely vibrant on this, and it's also brighter. I still think the RG Cube is plenty sharp, and it almost looks sharper than the Odin. But between these two, well, the Odin's just going to win obviously, but I do think that the RG Cube has a really good panel. This is the biggest feature of this device, is this nice screen. Anbernic just put a really good screen in this thing. This is actually very surprising because I've never been really blown away by Anbernic panels. It's just so sharp and it looks so vibrant. They did a really good job. I'm definitely impressed by the screen on this device, and I don't think I've ever said that about an Anbernic unit. At minimum brightness, this thing is basically so dark you can't even see it in the light. If I shut off my lights though, you should be able to see that pretty decently. Actually, this gets so dark, even with the lights shut off, you can still barely see it. Even with all my lights shut off, you still can't barely see it. The screen on this gets extremely dark. Max brightness on this panel is also extremely good, even with super bright lights on them. As far as the refresh rate goes, well, this is a true 60Hz panel. You shouldn't have any stuttering issues or anything with this. This is really nice to see, and I haven't seen any flickering at all on this. All in all, again, I just gotta reiterate that this is a really good screen. If you want to use this as a media device, you can even go up to 4K HDR on YouTube. Unfortunately, 4K and 1080p HDR anyways is a little stuttery. I'm not sure why. The second time loading the video though, 1080p HDR is really smooth, so I'm not sure why it was stuttery the first time. You can zoom in as well on YouTube, but unfortunately it cuts off some of the edges of the video, so it doesn't look very good. you are going to end up with some pretty big black bars on the top and bottom if you want to watch videos on this. Starting off with some games, let's try out some Gameboy on here. Gameboy looks really nice and it fills out a lot of the panel. The controls also feel very retro-like, and I think this is a really good system for Gameboy, and for the most part, this is the kind of systems that you want to play on this device. All in all, if you want this for Gameboy, you're going to get a nice big screen, and it's going to feel pretty fun to play on here. In fact, Gameboy is probably one of the best systems that I played on this device. Gameboy Color also looks really good on this panel, and it fills out the screen quite a bit. Gameboy is definitely going to be one of the best systems to play on this. Unfortunately, when it comes to Game Boy Advance, you are going to get some pretty big black bezels, but Game Boy and Game Boy Color look really good on here. That nice bright screen is showing quite a lot of detail, and there's nothing washed out. I gotta say it, Game Boy is definitely the best system to play on this device. Game Boy Advance looks good on here, but it does have some pretty big black bezels. I don't think I would personally buy this device specifically for Game Boy Advance, but if you wanted to play it on there, you definitely could. The D-pad makes playing Game Boy Advance on this pretty comfortable. You could probably also get some nice overlay packs, and I think that would make this look a lot better. This doesn't usually bother me, and if this isn't something that bothers you either, I still think you're going to have a lot of fun on here with Game Boy Advance. Nintendo DS plays pretty good on here. By default, they put this little overlay on, and I think this looks actually pretty good. You get a nice big screen up top, and you get a nice small little touchscreen on the bottom. This is also really smooth, so I think you're just going to have a lot of fun with this overall. And I think this is actually better than playing on a landscape device like the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. With the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, you are going to get a bigger top screen, but that small screen is going to be off to the side, and I just don't think it looks as good. This is a pretty good device for 3DS, and probably one of the best emulation systems I've seen for it. Another system that's really fun to play on here is Sega Dreamcast. This is my probably all-time favorite retro system, so I'm happy to see this works good too. A lot of the games on this system in particular require analog triggers, especially with these fishing games. If I pull down the trigger ever so slightly, I'll reel in really slow, but as I push it down, that'll speed up. Performance is excellent, but you do get some big black bars on the bottom and the top. You can probably mess around with the aspect ratio just to get this looking a little bit better, but I haven't really touched this. This is going to be what it looks like just right out of the box. I don't know why, but just for some reason this D-pad makes Sega Genesis pretty fun on here. Pretty easy to mash down the buttons for fighting games like this, and the D-pad is just really comfortable overall. I would go as far as to say that this is probably the best system that I've ever played Genesis on. DS is going to give you a pretty interesting experience. By default, it's going to put some bezels on this. This makes it still pretty nice, but it is squishing that down, so it's a pretty small screen. At least you get similar size screens, just like on a real DS. Because this is taller than most horizontal handhelds, these screens are going to be much bigger. If this was on something like the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, you would get much smaller screens, especially if you oriented the screen this way. A lot of these old games have very good aspect ratios for this screen, and you can tinker around with these to make them fit even better. Thermals are pretty good, but after playing for a little while, it has gone up to about 39 degrees Celsius, or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This is with the fans off though, so if you want some cooler gameplay, I definitely recommend turning this on. However, near your hand, you're only going to see about 35 degrees Celsius. This is still pretty warm though, so I would keep that fan on smart. The hottest part is definitely up near the top, by where the exhaust is. That's 42 degrees Celsius, or 107 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep the fan on smart, and I don't think the temperatures are going to bother you. I just shut off the fan because I wanted to see how hot this thing would get with that off. The battery life on it's been pretty good so far, and I find the estimates pretty accurate to what Anbernic was stating. I left this in standby for a few days, completely forgetting about it. The battery's only gone down to about 70%. This was at about 80 from when I started. It's only gone down about 10 to 20% in a couple days. It's not bad, but there's a little bit of battery drain. Interestingly enough, this charge is actually pretty quick. We're getting 5-volt charging at 2 amps with 10-watt charging. This also supports charging via USB-C to USB-C. I think the best thing about this is having USB-C to USB-C charging. I'm trying to get rid of my USB-A to USB-C cables and just have everything USB-C. I think the RG Cube is aimed at people that want to play old nostalgic retro games. While the aspect ratio doesn't fit perfectly with every system, it does give you a really big screen on most of them. It has one of the best in class D-pads I've ever seen on a device, and I absolutely love it for these old titles. We also have some really good face buttons, and they're rubber membrane. I don't like dome buttons, and these are very comfortable to use. These are pretty decent joysticks all around, and if you've used the Switch joystick before, you already know what these are like. I really like this combo button, and I think the button placement is pretty good overall. I'm still not quite used to the volume on the side, but it doesn't bother me overall. These triggers are also pretty decent. One of the biggest things I like about this device is the ergonomics. This thing is more ergonomic than most small devices that I've seen at this price range. To me anyways, this just feels like an Odin 2 and kind of squished down into a square. That incredible screen is just really the star of the show. Coupled with nice ergonomics, a good D-pad, solid face buttons, decent joysticks, and incredible speakers, the RG Cube is just absolutely incredible. And I think this one is definitely worth checking out if you like those older systems. I'll leave an affiliate link and a non-affiliate link in the description below if you're interested in picking this up. I would highly recommend getting it from Mech DIY. After this one was sent out, they've gone back and rechecked all their RG Cubes. That gives me reassurance that if you guys order from them, you shouldn't have that issue. But their customer service seems excellent so far. So, is the RG Cube worth it for you, and what do you like about it? Do you own one so far, and what do you think about it? As for me, I think I'm going to be playing a lot of Sega Genesis on this. Let me know what you think of the RG Cube in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and as always, thanks for watching.